This is not Agave Utahensis Eborispina. This is not Eborispina either. This isn't Eborispina, this is not Eborispina, and this is definitely not Eborispina. So then why are all these plants listed as Agave Utahensis Eborispina? Why are there so many sellers that are lying to you, particularly on the internet, about what Agave Utahensis Eborispina is? That's what we're gonna talk about in this video. Why you're being lied to about Agave Utahensis Eborispina and how to protect yourself from this kind of misinformation. The reason you're being lied to about Agave Utahensis Eborispina is actually really simple. It's money, it's greed. You see, a plant listed as Agave Utahensis Eborispina, whether it really is or not, will sell for a lot more money than a plant simply labeled Agave Utahensis or Agave Utahensis nevadensis. And the sellers who are lying to you about Eborispina are counting on you not knowing the difference between Eborispina and the other forms of Utahensis. Now, thankfully, it's actually really easy to tell if a plant is Eborispina or not, but to do so, first we have to understand the taxonomy of Agave Utahensis in general. Within Agave Utahensis, there are actually four taxa of agave, four types of Agave Utahensis. And I've talked about this in other videos in the channel, but there's Agave Utahensis cababensis. That's the largest of all the Agave Utahensis species. And it only grows around the Grand Canyon and the Kaibab Plateau in Arizona. And then there's what I call regular degular Utahensis, or subspecies Utahensis. And then beneath that subspecies, there's everybody's favorite, the two collectors' favorites, variety Eborispina and variety nevadensis. Now, whether or not those two are varieties or subspecies are formed, we'll talk about in a little bit in this video. But first I want to discuss what the difference is between Eborispina and nevadensis. So according to legendary agave botanist Howard Scott Gentry in his seminal work, Agaves of Continental North America, which was published in 1982, there's basically one primary difference between Eborispina and nevadensis, right? Now, I've talked about other differences between Eborispina and nevadensis. Primarily the nevadensis often has wavy spines, typically in my experience grows in higher elevations, and it's often bluer in color. But actually in Gentry, in Howard Scott Gentry's book, there's one primary difference between those two, and that's terminal spine length, right? So he says that nevadensis has terminal spines, that's the spines at the tip of each leaf, that are between 3 and 8 centimeters. And that's something like 1 to 3 inches, okay? And then Eborispina has much longer spines. He says that they're between 10 and 20 centimeters, which is like 4 to 8 inches. So when it comes to trying to figure out whether a plant is Eborispina or nevadensis, we can talk about geography and elevation and leaf color, but what it really boils down to is spine length. And in fact, that's why in many markets, Eborispina is more desired. It commands a higher price in many markets because of its more elaborate spines, longer spines. So Eborispina has those 4 to 8 inch terminal spines. Nevadensis has 1 to 3 inch terminal spines. So when you're looking at a plant, if it doesn't have spines that are 4 inches long, if the plant's mature and it doesn't have spines that are at least 4 inches long, then it's nevadensis. And so I showed a bunch of examples at the beginning of this video. You may have seen those were clearly not Eborispina. Those spines were all well under 4 inches, and many of them were within the range 1 to 3 inches of nevadensis. So you may be asking yourself, why are sellers online lying about whether or not a plant is Eborispina? And I mentioned this already, but primarily because Eborispina can go for more money. You can sell Eborispina for more money because it's perceived to have longer spines, right? And of course, therein lies the problem with lying about Eborispina, is that if there are enough sellers lying about what Eborispina is, eventually people are just gonna think it's got short spines like nevadensis. And I've heard the explanation that many sellers might not know better, right? They may have been sold a plant or seeds or whatever as Eborispina that aren't Eborispina, and they're just passing that misinformation on. The problem with that argument is that a lot of the sellers that I see selling it claim to be agave experts, claim to know the provenance, claim to know where the plants are coming from, and they're still claiming them as Eborispina. In fact, I actually talked to. I approached one of the sellers that I use as an example in the beginning part of this video, and I said, hey, look, according to Gentry, these spines are not long enough to be Eborispina. What do you think? And I was assured by them that they, quote, know their agaves, but they are clearly selling plants that are not Eborispina. First thing to note from all of this is that you need to buyer beware, caveat emptor. When you're buying plants online, particularly Agave Utahensis, although I'm told by experts that this sort of mislabeling and lying happens in other plants all the time. But when you're looking at an Agave Utahensis plant, if you're looking for Eborispina, that means you're probably looking for really long spines, okay? So make sure you're getting a plant with really long spines. If it's a mature plant, the spine should be over 4 inches. If they're not over 4 inches, it's probably not Eborispina. And if it's a young plant, you kind of got to go by the sort of relationship of the ratio between the leaf length and the spine length, right? And Agave Utahensis, subspecies Utahensis, variety, either Eborispina or Nevadensis, are not very large plants. They're seldom more than a foot in diameter, and that's typically a pretty big plant for either one of them. So when you're looking at a young plant, you generally, if it's Eborispina, the spines are going to be almost the same or longer than the leaves themselves. Okay, so that's the first thing. Buyer beware. When you're buying Agave Utahensis online, don't buy a plant because somebody tells you that it's Eborispina. Look at the plant, and if the spines are less than 4 inches or 10 centimeters, it's not Eborispina. That also, you should beware then that if you see a seller that's mislabeling a plant as Eborispina when it's clearly not, we should probably also wonder what else are they lying to you about. But that's a separate story, probably for a separate video. Now, the other important thing to understand is the taxonomy of Agave Utahensis. Like I said, there's 4 taxa. I use that word taxa there because whether or not Eborispina and Nevadensis are varieties, what I typically refer to them as, or if they're actually subspecies or merely forms, is a bit up in the air, right? So as I said, Gentry refers to them as varieties, and that's typically how I refer to them because again, Howard Scott Gentry's book is like the seminal book on agaves, right? There is some more recent taxonomy though that challenges that notion. There's some work from 2012 that categorizes Nevadensis and Eborispina as mere dwarf forms of Utahensis, of regular Utahensis. And that is in fact true. They are much smaller than Utahensis. So I don't think that's entirely inappropriate. And really, if it wasn't just easier to say variety Nevadensis and variety Eborispina, I would probably refer to them as just forms. And then there's some even more recent work that I'm a little dubious of, but it suggests that Nevadensis and Eborispina are actually their own subspecies underneath Agave Utahensis. Now, I think the problem with categorizing them either as a subspecies or even as different varieties is the fact that they seem to occur sort of on a spectrum, right? I have made videos where I've talked about the differences between Eborispina and Nevadensis, and I've talked about the fact that Eborispina typically grows in lower elevations, and it tends to have a greener leaf compared to Nevadensis, growing in higher elevations and often having more of a blue glaucous leaf, and often more wavy spines, right? There's shorter spines on Nevadensis than Eborispina's longer spines, but I tend to see Nevadensis with wavier spines. The problem with that is that there are exceptions to all of that, right? So first of all, a lot of the taxonomy of Utahensis, and particularly Nevadensis and Eborispina, relies on geography. That is, somebody will label an area, oh, this is an Eborispina area, or this is a Nevadensis area, and then just assume that every single plant that's in that area is Nevadensis or is Eborispina. And for the most part, that's typically true. However, not too long ago, I actually posted a photo on my Instagram of a plant growing in what is traditionally very deep in Nevadensis territory that had really long spines. It had spines where the ratio of the spine to the leaf was approaching what we would expect out of Eborispina. And it was also a fairly blue plant, and it was growing up at a high elevation, maybe 6,000 feet or so. And I asked folks, my followers on Instagram, whether or not they thought this was Eborispina and Nevadensis. And I did the poll in 2 different ways. And in one version of the poll, Eborispina won overwhelmingly because of the long spines. And in another one, the results were sort of mixed. Probably kind of obvious that since I had done the poll twice, that it was sort of a trick question, But all that to say that geography isn't a great indicator of Eborispina versus Nevadensis in every single case. I've absolutely seen plants with short spines growing in traditionally Eborispina locations, and then definitely seen very long spine plants growing in areas that are traditionally Nevadensis. There is also the problem of coloration. Again, I believe that generally speaking, Nevadensis is bluer and grows in higher elevations, but I've seen photos and seen plants myself that have very, very long spines growing in traditionally Eborispina areas, so you would very easily call them Eborispina, but the leaves are quite blue, typically because they're growing up at a much higher elevation where UV exposure is greater, resulting in that protective blue glaucous covering. And the reverse, right? If you look at a plant growing with Nevadensis traits otherwise, but it's growing in shade, so it's not getting the same kind of UV stress to require that blue coloration, a lot of those plants will look fairly green. And in fact, in some of the seedlings that I grow here, now while I primarily grow indoors under high power LED lights, most of my plants are very, very blue. Most of the plants that I've grown so far are Nevadensis, and those are blue as you would expect them to be, but they're under those high powered lights. But I've actually put a decent number of seedlings of, Agave Utahensis Nevadensis seedlings outside. And here in Las Vegas, the summer will melt. The summer sun, the powerful summer sun here, will melt a seedling in a matter of hours, probably not even an hour before the plant starts to yellow and dies. And so to protect those plants, I put them under a 50% shade cloth. So my outdoor plants are actually getting quite a bit less UV exposure than my indoor plants under those super high power LED panels. And the outdoor plants, while coming from the exact same seed stock, the exact same mother plants as the indoor plants, tend to be much greener. So that coloration, while generally a pretty good indicator of, blue is Nevadensis, green is Eborispina, again, much like geography, is not 100% set in stone. So when it comes down to it at the end of the day, all we really have to rely on is spine length. And again, that's sort of up in the air as well. There are, Nevadensis plants that have very long spines and Eborispina plants that have fairly short spines. So what it comes down to is what you, the collector, are looking for when you're trying to buy an Eborispina plant or a Nevadensis plant. And generally what that comes down to, if I ask you to picture an Eborispina plant, you're probably gonna picture something with super long spines. So again, this goes back to the original point of the video. Eborispina plants have long spines. They have 10 to 20 centimeter spines. That is 4 to 8 inch spines. Nevadensis spines, on the other hand, are 1 to 3 inches. So if you see a plant online that is being sold to you as Eborispina, but it has short spines, you are being lied to about Agave Utahensis Eborispina. So I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Have you ever seen a plant listed incorrectly online that was listed as Eborispina that was clearly not Eborispina? I showed you a whole bunch. Have you seen any other examples? I would love to hear about them. Or have you seen this happen with other plants, not just Agave Utahensis? Thanks for watching.